Welcome, everyone, to another podcast from the Al-Attiyah Foundation, part of a series that seeks to address the urgent energy topics of the day. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor-at-large for Reuters, based out of London. And as always, I'm delighted to be hosting another of these discussions. A little bit of context first. Our title today, Energy and Green Growth, Implications for Energy Policy After the 2020 US Election. Of course, given its role as one of the largest suppliers and consumers of energy in the world, the change in administration in the US extremely relevant to energy policy and energy supply and demand. Of course, Joe Biden is making his staff choices right now. As of today, Wednesday, November 25th, no word yet on energy secretary, but we did hear just a couple of days ago that John Kerry, former Secretary of State, has been tapped to serve as special climate envoy. The vaccine rally for most markets continues. Crude prices also up again on hopes of increased demand. Throw in there an orderly presidential transition, plus expectations of more OPEC cuts, and the context actually looks pretty positive. Let me introduce our guest today, Marianne Kah. Marianne is an adjunct senior research scholar and advisory board member at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Before that, she served as chief economist for ConocoPhillips for 25 years. Prior to that, Marianne was the manager of corporate planning at Cabot Corporation in Boston and a coordinator of strategic planning at Conoco in Houston. Marianne, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the day that I can actually return to Doha.
Indeed, me too. Let me start with the short term, the very short term. We're in this so-called lame duck period between administrations. Are you expecting any last-minute changes in energy policy or changes in regulation before January 20th?
Absolutely. I mean, the Trump administration has been pursuing an agenda of rolling back Obama-era environmental regulations, and those specifically on oil and gas production. And these efforts will likely accelerate in the last 2 months of the administration. They're also trying to freeze air quality standards and weaken the protections of the Endangered Species Act, which is a constraint in drilling in many areas. But the biggest thing you have actually seen most recently is by agency order, 1.5 million acres of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is being opened for oil and gas drilling. They're probably not going to be able to fit a lease sale in during the remainder of the term, but they might initiate seismic testing. So those are the things you're likely to see, but I would also say that those are the things that the Biden administration is likely to reverse when they get
right.
in.
And I guess that's the question, and we'll come on to some of these things, just how quickly they can be reversed. Just stepping back for a second, I mentioned the context. Crude prices up, the markets are up, the Dow just yesterday getting to 30,000. Now that we're talking very realistically about vaccines, the markets are reacting accordingly. The supply cuts might also keep a support under a longer term under this market. How long do you think this momentum can keep up?
Well, I think, at least in the United States, part of the momentum will be due to whether we get fiscal stimulus or not. Yeah. Because I think we might lose momentum in the U.S. this winter as the unemployment benefits expire and those sorts of things happen, because the U.S. economy is very much based on consumer spending. So we are worried about that. But in terms of activity levels, individual driving activity in many places around the world recovered actually fairly quickly. It's backing off now because of the loss of jobs and increased telecommuting. But while the volume of driving is receding, it's still viewed as a safe activity, and it's substituting for mass transit and for some air travel trips. So I would say that driving and gasoline demand is actually holding up very well. Jet fuel demand, of course, is the biggest problem because people can't travel internationally.
Sure.
But in terms of the oil market, it's really global demand and China's demand that matters. And the IEA, for example, is forecasting that we lose about 9 million barrels a day this year, but get 6 million barrels a day back next year. But most people forecast that we're not going to get back to 2019 levels of demand until 2022.
Right. Okay. Very, very quickly, Marianne, on the fiscal stimulus. Yes, it's critical, but I guess the big question has to be, what is Joe Biden going to be able to get through Congress if indeed the Senate stays Republican come January. That's going to have a big impact, right?
Right. And if it was a solid Republican win, then I would say we'd already have a fiscal stimulus, but it would be a very low one. The Republicans don't want to spend as much money as the Democrats, who want to spend like $2 trillion. So we're probably not going to get the $2 trillion bill. In fact, if I had to guess, I would say that the most likely outcome is you have to have a bill by December 11th, or the government shuts down, some sort of government spending bill. And my guess is they'll tack on the most important elements like unemployment benefits to that, and it will be relatively small. But that's what probably will get done. Okay.
Let's talk a little bit about, we've got plenty to talk about, but let's talk a little bit about Paris. And I'll come on to John Kerry as well in just a moment. Joe Biden has said he wants to rejoin. Give us first your thoughts on how likely you think that is, how quickly that can happen, and whether the US can achieve its commitments to reduce emissions, again, given this divided Congress.
Well, I think that the Paris Agreement probably will be announced rejoining it on day one, because he does not need congressional approval to do it. Apparently, the Senate approved it back in 1992 under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So he doesn't need, legal experts don't believe he needs any kind of Senate consent to rejoin. So that's a day one thing. Now, whether or not we actually can meet our commitments is a whole other issue. But, our emissions in the US now, our greenhouse gas emissions, are about 20% below 2005 levels. Now, some of that, of course, is from COVID, but a lot of it is from low-cost shale gas used in the power sector, as well as renewables. So we are sort of on track to meet it despite ourselves at the moment. But it is going to be difficult with a divided Congress, because it means you can't have big legislation on climate. You probably can't have a carbon tax. You're going to have to aim for smaller pieces of legislation that have bipartisan support, like renewable tax credits and things like that, if you can couch it as a jobs bill. There's a growing number of Republicans who support a carbon tax. Not enough to get it done now, but surveys show that young Republicans actually support government climate action. So I think the demographics in the US are moving in a way that you're going to see more support over time. But I think things like raising fuel efficiency standards for cars, supporting electrification in a way that I don't know if he's going to get the funding for his 500,000 EV charging stations, but he just through the Clean Air Act, he will be able to achieve a lot. And he also will try to get to decarbonizing the power sector through Clean Air Act executive regulation. Yep. Those things, the Obama regulations in that regard, were challenged in court. And Trump's rollback is challenged in court. Everything we need to do in the U.S. is challenged in court. So it's going to be a long, arduous process.
Interesting. I had a wonderful conversation a couple of days ago with the self-proclaimed stubborn optimist Christiana Figueres, of course, the architect of this Paris Climate Accord. The optimism really shines through at the moment, I've got to say. I don't know if you saw that wonderful Twitter video of her dancing around when Biden was named the victor. That aside, one point she made I found important is that any climate investment that Biden makes has to be linked to a pandemic recovery investment, and that's the way this will happen.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, you're going to have to find a way to link it to jobs. But a lot of things can, like renewable development can be linked to jobs, green jobs. Even the EV infrastructure on highways could be linked to jobs. So I guess the question is, how good a salesman is Biden going to be to the Republican senators to get them to accept these things? And Biden is probably the best person to do that. He has relationships, long relationships with a lot of people in the Senate on both sides of the aisle. So if anyone can pull that off, I think it would be him.
I mentioned no energy secretary announcement yet, but of course we have heard that John Kerry is going to get this climate czar role. What's he going to bring to the role? What should the oil producers, the gas producers of the world expect from him?
Well, he's had a climate bill in Congress. In fact, when I was with ConocoPhillips actually helped his team work on that. So he has a history of trying to get climate legislation through. He also has a history of diplomacy. So he has actually the perfect combination of skills to be a climate envoy. He's a very strong candidate. And I think it was done to send a message to the world that the U.S. is serious now about reducing its greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. Very quickly, Ernie Moniz from MIT, who served as Energy Secretary under Obama, is a name being thrown around for Energy Secretary. What would that appointment mean for the energy markets?
Well, no, Ernie is definitely focused on climate change. He has a organization he's working now that does lots of studies on it. In fact, I'm actually involved in one of his projects in New Mexico. Ernie is, he knows the energy sector. He knows the technology it takes to decarbonize every sector in the country. So he would be ideal from that point of view. Also on the nuclear side, he's a nuclear physicist. He's the guy who negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, for example, from the US side. So he'd be a great candidate, but he actually deals with the oil industry. So the question is he going to be viewed as pure enough by the more extreme sides of the Democrats to be energy secretary? But he's so talented. I have to believe he's going to get some role in the administration. It may be focused on science and technology. It may not be energy, but I have to believe that the administration will want him.
Okay, I want to move on to sort of looking at the outlook for specific fuels. And in fact, because you mentioned nuclear and Ernie is the nuclear scientist, let's start with nuclear, because there has been some increasing interest in small-scale nuclear in the US, but some cities have backed away from hosting trials. Do you think the US will ever really embrace nuclear again?
Well, there actually has been some activity in that space. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission recently approved a power company's application for small nuclear reactors in a Utah Associated Municipal Power System, but the plan there is to have it provide carbon-free power for like 50 municipalities. But outside of that project, there doesn't seem to be much interest. And I would say the main reason is we have such cheap shale gas and low-cost, gas-fired power. Nuclear of any sort is going to be viewed as expensive. In fact, the interesting thing is the Utah Taxpayers Association, after this project I just mentioned, tried suing to stop the modular reactor project just because of its high cost. So I think it's the economics of nuclear that are problematic. One thing that I watch, though, is fusion. Chevron just invested in a fusion company, and fusion, everyone knows how to do it. It's really an engineering question whether you can get it actually done at an economic level. And so that's something I think we all need to watch that space.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about gas, the overall view of gas, the methane emission problem, et cetera, et cetera. But let me start with, again, back to Joe Biden, because there seemed to be a little bit confusion. He's really walking a tightrope here. It seemed to me, especially during the campaign, and the right combination of policies could push gas. Some people are saying out of the energy mix altogether by 2035.
Right. In fact, in Europe, for example, power plants fueled by gas were just classified as not being sustainable or transition investment fuels unless they meet emission limits that are so low that none currently comply. So gas is literally being pushed out of the power sector in Europe. In the United States, with renewable tax credits and renewable mandates in many different states, natural gas is being pushed out, for example, in California, even in Texas, because we have so much wind in Texas and now solar is coming in. The prices of electricity are so low that it's uneconomic to build new natural gas plants in Texas. So I think in the industrialized world, this is a big problem. Permitting interstate gas pipelines in the United States has turned out to be a huge problem. A big one was just canceled in the Marcellus Shale region on the east coast of the US. And another one was just delayed. So some of that gas could end up being shut in. One question about the Biden administration is, will it be difficult to permit oil and gas pipelines and LNG facilities? The Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, both of which Biden appoints people to, have to approve LNG export facilities. And one thing they have said is they're going to add climate change and environmental justice as new lenses to the permitting process. So it could be very difficult to permit fossil fuel related energy infrastructure. Then you have, I guess the industrialized world is concerned about methane emissions. In fact, I read an interesting article today that said that Biden may be the best friend the oil and gas industry of the US ever had, that he's going to clean it. So, for example, the case with ENGIE saying that they're not going to import US LNG because they don't like the carbon footprint. Well, Biden may clean that up. So the US is now considered an acceptable source of natural gas. So interesting things may actually, unexpected things may actually come out of this administration.
Yeah.
I think gas is challenged in the industrial world. The issue in the developing world is the cost. The cost has to be kept down so it competes with coal, particularly in those countries that have lots of coal resources.
Well, let's get a word on coal. You know, what is the future? Is it the end now?
Well, I think we're close to the end on coal. I mean, if certainly in the United States, I think we're not seeing much coal demand. I think it's dropped by a huge amount because of shale gas, because of the economics. And so trying to bring it back, the Trump administration tried to revive it, but it really wasn't possible because it's just not economic in the US. I think that if you look at the profitability of coal companies, the largest one, Peabody, is probably going to file for bankruptcy for the second time in 5 years. That should tell you that the industry is not doing very well. And there's the number of electrical equipment providers have recently announced that they're no longer going to build coal-fired power plants, all the big ones. So I would say that coal really is on its way out.
Okay. And just a couple.
Except for in Asia, it's probably going to grow. The use is probably going to grow in Asia for the next, so at least till 2030.
Yeah. Okay. Couple more questions, Marianne. The hydrogen economy. Interested to hear on this because in Europe and East Asia, there's a lot of interest, it seems to me, in the hydrogen economy. What's it like in the US?
Well, I think California has always been interested in it for at least 20, 30 years because they would like to have fuel cells in cars and trucks. But lately, there's been a lot of discussion in the US about how to use hydrogen to both to store renewable power, to deal with the intermittency of renewables, and to decarbonize heavy industry. A lot of talk, very little action. I think we do have a few what we call blue hydrogen projects, which means they're taking from a refinery natural gas. When you reform methane, you can get, that's one way of getting hydrogen. And then if you capture the carbon and sequester it, it's called blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen is where you actually have a renewable process or a non-carbon related process to create the hydrogen. For example, using renewables and electrolysis or nuclear and electrolysis. So we don't have any green hydrogen projects that I'm aware of in the US yet, but we have at least 2 large blue hydrogen projects. But I think in the Biden administration, hydrogen will get a lot of R&D support. And I think that's something that will probably, technology innovation is something that the Republicans also appreciate. So you may get funding on both sides of the aisle and approved on those sorts of things.
Yeah. Okay. Marianne, just to sort of wrap it up, emission-free US. I mean, it seems, well, put it this way, we're talking about it more, but it still seems a way off. I just want to get your view on that. What fuels will prevail? Which technology? I mean, you talk about technology and R&D. Which technologies are going to be key? Which industries will cope well? Which will struggle?
Well, I mean, if you look at assuming we go in economic order, what makes the most sense, the lowest cost decarbonization alternatives are going to be in the power sector. And the cost of solar and wind have been greatly reduced. So a lot of that is happening, particularly with investment tax credits. So I think the first thing the Biden administration will do is try to extend the investment tax credits for renewables. And that had bipartisan support. So he probably will get that done. He'll probably use electrification as the key strategy to reduce, fossil fuel demand. Transportation is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And the reason for that is that shale gas has basically replaced coal in the power sector. So I think focus will now shift to the transportation sector. And we've already talked about the fact that he wants to increase electric vehicle charging stations. other incentives to electrification and EVs may be difficult in a divided Congress, but he may be able to sell the EV part as a green jobs initiative. He will try to reduce the carbon footprint of the U.S. building stock, creating incentives for retrofits that combine appliance, electrification, efficiency, on-site power generation. He will definitely, move to things like innovation for battery storage, negative emissions technologies, and that's the big question. Will he support CCS, carbon capture and storage, which actually supports the life of fossil fuels? I mean, some of his constituents are going to be dead against that, but I think that's something that would have bipartisan support. So he may go through with that, and that, of course, allows you to have these blue hydrogen projects. So I would say that overall, electricity and renewables will be winners, and fossil fuels will generally be losers. The big question about natural gas will be whether he supports natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration as a contender for low carbon in the power sector. The environmental regulations he comes forth will raise the cost of U.S. oil and gas production. But with lower oil and gas production, you well know that means there's higher global oil and gas prices, because the U.S. is a source that has been reducing oil and gas prices. So whatever U.S. producers lose on the side of cost and volumes, they might make up on the price side.
Yeah.
But I think my message to Doha would be the big thing that what needs to happen globally is support for natural gas with CCS as a low carbon contender in the power sector, and also as a way of coming up with industrial steam. Because right now, I fear that Europe, at least, is focused more on hydrogen and less on using methane directly.
All right, Marianne, look, I'm going to stop it there. We have covered a lot of ground, and it's been really fascinating. So I want to thank you for your insights. Marianne Kah, everyone joining us there. Thank you very much for sharing your views on the future energy trends in the US. To everyone listening, do watch this space for the next Al-Attiyah podcast in the series. It's been a pleasure hosting this one as always. I'm Axel Threlfall. Thank you and goodbye.